The first thing Emmanuel remembered was the taste of dust, thick, choking, clinging to his throat like punishment before the verdict even came. They had dragged him into the courthouse like an animal, wrists bound, shirt torn at the collar. The marble floor gleamed under his bare feet, a cruel contrast to his grime-covered skin. The courtroom was silent, not the kind of respectful silence given to justice, but the kind born of indifference, cold, final. The judge barely looked up from his papers, spectacles perched low on his nose. Emmanuel's heart thudded like a war drum in his chest. He searched the room, not a single familiar face. No one from his village had made the trip. His sister was dead. His mother, too poor to leave the fields. His court-appointed lawyer sat beside him, eyes hollow, lips tight. He hadn't asked Emmanuel a single question, not about the night Laurent Guerra's warehouse was robbed, or how Emmanuel had been home nursing a twisted ankle. None of it seemed to matter. Then came the word. Guilty. The gavel struck wood like an axe cleaving bone. 15 years. He didn't cry, not even when the guards pulled him from the courtroom. He did glance up just once. In the back of the room, Laurent Guerra stood with his arms crossed, a self-satisfied curl on his lips. Emmanuel knew that look. Guerra had owned the factory where Emmanuel worked. He'd also owned the police, the judge, and the story that would now define the next decade of Emmanuel's life. And so, at 24, Emmanuel disappeared from the world. The sun rose over Ouagadougou, not with urgency, but with quiet insistence, casting its golden haze over the city like a soft benediction. Its rays spilled over the corrugated rooftops, warming the painted wood of the fruit stands, glinting off the metal pans of women preparing millet cakes along the roadside. Motorbikes buzzed sleepily in the distance, trailing ribbons of dust as the city stirred to life. Children laughed in the alleyways, chasing after a rusted bicycle rim with sticks, bare feet kicking up powdery sand. Their joy, unfiltered and wild, cut through the heaviness of morning like sunlight through broken blinds. And high above it all, on the veranda of the presidential residence, stood Captain Ibrahim Traoré, arms folded, eyes narrowed against the amber light. He wasn't dressed for ceremony. No suit, no medals, no polished shoes. Just his crisp brown fatigue shirt and weather-worn boots. An intentional symbol, a quiet rebellion against the excesses of power. Around him, the compound remained hushed, the staff not yet bustling with the day's demands. Traoré took a slow breath and closed his eyes for a moment. In the stillness, he listened, not to the rustle of trees or the flutter of morning doves, but to the pulse of the city beneath him, the hum of a people trying to live, trying to endure, trying to matter. Today was not for ribbon cuttings or televised decrees. Today was for the unseen. He turned toward the driveway where a nondescript military vehicle waited. "Take me to the prison," he said quietly to the driver. The young man blinked in surprise. "Sir? The prison?" No announcements, no photographers, no entourage, just drive. The driver hesitated only a moment, then gave a sharp nod. "Yes, Captain." Traoré climbed into the back seat and closed the door with finality. The vehicle pulled out of the gates, merging into the slowly awakening city. Vendors were just beginning to open shop, lifting tarps and sweeping out the dust. A man in a long tunic rolled a heavy cart filled with fried beignets, the scent of sugar and oil trailing behind him. Across the street, a mother strapped her baby to her back with a faded cloth, her toddler walking barefoot beside her. Traoré said nothing. He didn't need to. His eyes did the work, scanning, recording, interpreting. These were the people he had sworn to serve, not from behind glass or podiums, not through advisors and reports, but with his own 2 eyes, his own 2 hands. He watched a street boy wash his face with a trickle of water flowing from a broken pipe. An old woman with hunched shoulders sat by the roadside, selling peanuts from a woven bowl. A shoeless teenage boy, his eyes hollow and sharp, stared too long at the military vehicle before quickly turning away. Traoré noticed them all. He always had. It was one thing to govern a country. It was another to carry its pain. As they moved deeper into the outskirts of the city, the roads grew rougher. The buildings lost their shine. Rust replaced paint. Windows became holes. This was a different Ouagadougou, one that politicians rarely saw and cameras never visited. And then, through a veil of brown air and distant barking dogs, the looming bulk of Ouagadougou Central Prison came into view. The structure sat like a wound on the edge of the capital, imposing, gray, corroded by time. The barbed wire that curled along the top of the outer wall had long lost its sharpness. The guard towers leaned just slightly, their wooden platforms sagging like tired shoulders. As the car slowed to a halt, the heat seemed to thicken, pressing down with invisible hands. The faint smell of rot clung to the wind. Sweat, metal, human despair. Traoré stepped out before the driver could open the door. The guards at the main gate scrambled to attention, confusion on their faces. No one had told them the president would be visiting. There were no sniffer dogs, no media, no escorts. Just a man in brown fatigues and fire in his eyes. The warden came running, shirt soaked, face pale. His voice trembled with uncertainty. "Mr. President, we weren't informed." Traoré waved him silent with a single steady hand. That was the point. No pleasantries, no waiting for someone to explain the conditions. He didn't need a tour. He didn't want a sanitized presentation of the best-run prison in the region. He wanted truth, unfiltered, raw, uncomfortable. He walked past the main entrance and into the belly of the prison, where the real stories lived. The warden was already sweating as he approached, forced into a nervous jog by the sight of his unexpected visitor. "Mr. President, we weren't informed." "You weren't supposed to be," Traoré said, stepping out of the car. "Just let me walk." The air inside was like a tomb, thick, unmoving, rancid. Traoré didn't flinch. He moved slowly, his boots echoing against the cracked floor as he passed rows of cells. Eyes followed him. Some hopeful, some broken. Others so dulled by time they barely lifted their heads. He stopped to shake hands, to listen. An old man, eyes cataracted, told him he'd never had a trial. A boy, barely 20, had been beaten into confessing to a crime he couldn't name. Another man said he'd been arrested for protesting water shortages. His sentence, indefinite detention. Then Traoré saw him. A man sat alone in the far corner of the yard, his back against the wall, eyes fixed on nothing. Unlike the others, he didn't stir when the guards whispered, "The president is here." He didn't look up. His silence was deeper than any scream. Traoré walked to him. Kneeling, he asked gently, "Your name?" The man turned slowly. His face was gaunt, beard unkempt, but his eyes still held the memory of dignity. "Emmanuel, what are you here for?" "Theft," Emmanuel whispered. "They said I stole from the warehouse I worked at. I didn't, but I didn't have a lawyer, no money, no family left. I appealed. No one listened." "How long?" 7 years. Traoré looked into the eyes of a man who had been buried alive, and yet, somehow, was still breathing. "I believe you," he said, and those 3 words bent the air, shook the dust, and cracked something ancient within that prison's walls. At the Ministry of Justice, the room went silent as Captain Ibrahim Traoré entered. No one had been informed. No one was prepared. He wasn't here for ceremony. He wasn't here for meetings. He was here for justice. He carried a single folder in his hand, worn, overstuffed, with corners curling like leaves in the dry season. Emmanuel's file. It slapped onto the polished wood of the central table with a sound like a gunshot. "Find everything," he said quietly, but the weight in his voice silenced the entire ministry. Every form, every signature, every vanished detail, every lie. His aides looked at one another, hesitant. Then they moved. Box after box came down from the archives. Dust rose like ghosts from the past. Clerks and junior ministers scrambled through stacks of old files and yellowed documents, eyes wide as they uncovered what had been hidden in plain sight for years. What they found in Emmanuel's case was grotesque. The judge who had sentenced him, he had a private offshore account brimming with large transfers, each neatly traced back to companies owned by Laurent Guerra. There was no ambiguity. It wasn't a suspicion. It was proof. Emmanuel's full case file had been misplaced, conveniently stripped of pages detailing his alibi and the names of 2 key witnesses who were never even contacted. The prosecutor had glossed over glaring contradictions in the police report, including a timestamp that proved Emmanuel wasn't even in the vicinity of the alleged theft. There had never been a trial, only a performance, a carefully choreographed demolition of a man's life. "This ends today," Traoré said. No yelling, no slamming fists, just truth, carved in steel. He didn't wait for the sluggish wheels of the system to turn. He cut through them. By sundown, a task force had been assembled. Its mission: identify every unjust imprisonment, every manipulated file, every forgotten case. The first findings were staggering. They found Isidore arrested 12 years ago for suspicious activity near a protest. He had never been formally charged, no court date, no trial. He had simply disappeared into the system, forgotten like a rusted nail in a collapsing building. Then came Jacob, picked up at 19, a university student walking home one night. The charge was armed robbery, but no weapon had been found. No victim had ever identified him. He was arrested because he was tall, because he wore a hoodie, because he was black in the wrong place. His file was thin, just a flimsy police report and a note saying, "Likely gang affiliation." No proof, no evidence, no voice. Then they found Thomas, a soft-spoken farmer in his 60s who had once held up a cardboard sign demanding fair pay after the government seized his crops during a drought relief program. For that, he'd been charged with inciting civil unrest. He was now gray, partially blind, and so weak he could barely stand in his cell. Each name they uncovered was like opening a grave. Each case was a betrayal of everything the law was supposed to stand for. Traoré didn't hold press conferences. He didn't rant on television or point fingers for applause. He just acted. He freed them, one by one. He fired the judge who condemned Emmanuel. He disbarred lawyers who had signed plea deals without speaking to their clients. He dismantled entire prosecutorial units where corruption flowed like tap water. He retrained prosecutors and demanded a new legal review board be created, independent, civilian-led, and immune to political interference. Within weeks, hundreds of case files were reopened. Dozens of prisoners were released. The stories flooded the streets, the markets, the radios. Burkina Faso was waking up. Across the country, people began writing the words, "Justice for the Forgotten," on walls and chalkboards. A slogan, yes, but also a promise that what happened to Emmanuel, Isidore, Jacob, and Thomas would never happen again. Because justice wasn't a privilege for the powerful, it was a right for the powerless. And Ibrahim Traoré made sure the forgotten were forgotten no more. The country froze when Laurent Guerra was arrested. The tycoon who had once toasted wine with generals now found himself behind bars, stripped of influence, publicly exposed. His smirk remained. He thought this was just for show, that he'd be released in a week, that a few bribes would smooth things over. But this wasn't the old system. This time, the judge was honest. This time, the documents were real. This time, witnesses spoke. Workers, secretaries, even a former police officer who had carried out Guerra's orders. And this time, Emmanuel sat in the front row, not in chains, not in silence. When he was called to the stand, he walked with quiet strength. "You took 7 years from me," he said to Guerra, "but you didn't take my voice, and you didn't take my hope." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Some wept, others stood. The verdict? Guilty. Guerra was sentenced to 18 years. The judge who'd once condemned Emmanuel was stripped of his title and banned from practicing law. 1 year later, the sun rose gently over the Capitol, casting soft gold across the grounds of the presidential palace. But this was no ordinary morning. Rows of chairs lined the manicured lawn, adorned with white fabric and small flags fluttering in the breeze. At the far end, a raised platform stood beneath a simple arch woven with vines, humble yet dignified. It was not a celebration of power, but of justice. Hundreds of men stood quietly, shoulder to shoulder. Most wore simple clothing, some carried canes, others bore the weight of age, of time stolen. But around each of their necks hung a white sash, symbolic, pure, and defiant. It was not a gift, it was a declaration. These were the forgotten, now remembered. Some had spent 5 years in prison, some 15. A few had survived decades. Not one had received a fair trial. And yet, they stood there now, not as victims, but as witnesses of failure, of survival, of hope reborn. At the center of the platform stood Emmanuel, wearing a tailored linen shirt, his back straight, his shoulders unshaking. The exhaustion once etched into his eyes had been replaced with something else: resolve. Beside him stood President Ibrahim Traoré, his uniform simple, without medals. He wasn't here as a commander or ruler. He was here as a man who had listened when others turned away, who had walked into a prison and heard a whisper no one else would hear. When Emmanuel stepped up to the podium, the crowd fell into absolute silence. His voice was calm, but each word carried weight. "Justice is not a luxury," he said. "It is not something only the rich can buy or the powerful can twist. It is a right, not for the few, for all of us." He paused. His eyes scanned the sea of faces. Freedmen, their families, officials, journalists. In the front row sat an old man in a wheelchair, weeping quietly, his son beside him with a trembling hand on his shoulder. We stand here today not because of vengeance, but because of truth, because someone finally listened, and through him, the doors that held us were opened, not just with keys, but with courage. The applause rose like thunder, but it wasn't just the sound of hands clapping. It was the sound of something breaking free. Years of silence, years of erasure. Each cheer was a piece of the past shaking off its chains. After the ceremony, the crowd mingled. Hugs were exchanged, photographs taken. Laughter rang out like bells, shaky, new, but real. And when the sun began to dip beyond the rooftops and the guests trickled away, the palace returned to quiet. Traoré remained behind. He walked slowly through the garden paths alone, hands clasped behind his back. The evening air was thick with the scent of hibiscus and warm dust. Crickets chirped in the hedges. Far off, the last strains of a flute drifted on the wind. He stopped beside a low stone wall, leaned against it, and exhaled deeply. The weight of the day was settling into his bones. Not from fatigue, but from truth. What had begun with Emmanuel had rippled into something greater. Systemic reforms were underway. More files were being reviewed. More prisons were being audited. More lives were being pulled back from darkness, but still, so much remained undone. There were more prisons, more names, more silence waiting to be broken. He looked up at the night sky, clear, endless. He thought about the men still locked away, the ones whose cases hadn't yet reached his desk. the ones who might still believe that no one was coming for them. And then he whispered to the air, as if to them, "I see you. I'm still coming." That was his vow. Because justice didn't end at a podium. It didn't end with a ceremony or applause. It had to live in every file opened, every official held accountable, every law rewritten, and most of all, in the simple, radical act of listening. The nation would remember the sashes, the speeches, the sunlit day on the lawn. But the real work, the quiet work, would continue long after. And in that moment, as moonlight bathed the garden in silver, Ibrahim Traoré knew one thing for certain. He hadn't just helped free a man. He had helped free a nation. Some chains are made of iron, others are crafted from neglect, from corruption, from the silence of those who look away. But when even one chain is broken, when one man dares to see the unseen and speak for the unheard, you don't just free a prisoner, you free a nation.